My name is Dan Riley, and I'm the Public Affairs Director for Efficiency Vermont. I am the State House Representative for VEIC and for Efficiency Vermont, but I also spent 15 years in Washington, D.C. working in Congress and in the Obama administration. So I was going to give an overview on Efficiency Vermont and thermal funding from both a state and a federal perspective. I am just going to start sharing my screen here. Just give me 1 minute. And hopefully everybody can see me there. So at any time, please jump in, ask questions, stop me at any time. I'm probably not going to talk for the whole 15 minutes. Just wanted to kind of give people a quick state of play before jumping into the discussion. Efficiency Vermont, really quick overview because I know it's complicated. We are the state's energy efficiency utility. We're funded on 3-year budget cycles through an energy efficiency charge on electric bills. I know most people on the call already know that. We're just at the beginning of a 3-year budget cycle now from 2021 to 2023. And we just had our budget approved by the Public Utility Commission a little while ago. For this 3-year period that we like to think in terms of, we really have 3 key themes. The first theme obviously is adaptability. It's a theme on everybody's mind. You know, every organization has to adapt to these unprecedented times. For us, for Efficiency Vermont, that's the COVID-19 response. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, how that's led to new weatherization offers. We launched a school indoor air quality program for K through 12 schools using CARES Act funding to improve air quality and reduce the transmission of COVID-19, helping schools reopen. And then the Energy Efficiency Modernization Act, which is a bill that passed last year, allowing Efficiency Vermont to work in transportation for the first time as part of a 3-year pilot program. The second real key theme is resiliency. I know that's something that town energy committees and that this crew talks a lot about in terms of economic resilience, helping Vermonters save more money, in terms of building resilience, whether that's homes or businesses, in terms of weatherization, reducing heating bills, making heating systems work better, more efficiently. And then obviously grid resilience as well as we see more disruptions from climate change. And the last key theme is accessibility, really ensuring that our services are accessible to all, especially low to moderate income Vermonters, and a diversity, equity, and inclusion analysis, and really making sure we're reaching all Vermonters. And if we're not, trying to figure out new ways to do that, you know, and really in terms of accessibility, geographic accessibility. You know, we know what works in Winooski might not always work in Woodstock. And so we need to ensure that our programs are accessible by all. In terms of the budget numbers and Efficiency Vermont's budget for the next 3 years, our total budget is going to be about $50 million per year. Our operating budgets are down 8% overall for this period. That is going to result in about a $7 million budget reduction for 2021. I mean, that really does reflect the COVID-19 realities that we're all living with. In order to keep those EEC rate charges flat for all customers, you know, for residents and commercial businesses, and we've seen a big slowdown in some of our commercial customers, in order to keep those rates flat, we did have to reduce our budget. And unfortunately, it did mean the difficult decision to reduce our workforce by a small amount this year. However, we really still are able to provide a high level of service. You know, for Efficiency Vermont, it's always a balancing act. You know, as certain markets mature, they need less incentives. I mean, I think about, you know, light bulbs and how energy efficient light bulbs have been able to get a little cheaper. We're able to balance that and still provide incentives where they're needed most. We're also, for this cycle, really thinking about new ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have a flexible load management program that builds on our partnership with the distribution utilities to identify technologies that can help shift electric usage away from peak periods when the grid is the dirtiest and when electricity is most expensive. And the other one is Refrigerant Management program. Refrigeration is one of the most energy intensive parts of the food and beverage business. And it also emits quite a high amount of greenhouse gas emissions. By detecting and repairing leaks, this program can help save businesses money and reduce GHG. And so we are very excited about both of those programs, as well as clarity on electrically funded weatherization, doing more with cold climate heat pumps. All three of those are very important now that the Global Warming Solutions Act has passed and we're entering a new era here in Vermont. In terms of weatherization funding, I want to start with the good news, which is that in 2020, Efficiency Vermont did more than ever before. In response to the pandemic, we launched our highest ever weatherization incentives, where we covered 75% of the project costs for qualified customers for weatherization projects. And qualified usually means low to moderate income. We were able to enroll 546 moderate income homes, complete over 1,200 weatherization projects overall, and pay out over $3.2 million in incentives. Those were all big numbers for us, and we're really proud of those. However, at Efficiency Vermont, our weatherization funding is projected to decline sharply. Bear with me a little bit because this is kind of complicated, but let me walk you guys through it. Usually most weatherization work that you would do around your home does not involve electricity. Therefore, it's difficult to fund with our EEC rate, with our EEC charge funds to avoid cross-subsidization. So at Efficiency Vermont, we have found other ways to fund this work, mostly through participating in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative auction and through the forward capacity market. How the nuts and bolts of that are complicated, but I think what I would really want to impress upon you here today is really, if you look at that 2019 peak, where Efficiency Vermont was bringing in over $12 million a year to fund our weatherization work, and you really see a steep decline in that all the way down to about $4 million for 2024. And almost equally alarming is that we project that it's going to stay flat for the rest of the decade. So we're not going to see it bounce and see it pop right back up. So it is very clear as we look at the thermal funding picture for Efficiency Vermont and really across the state, we are going to need new revenue sources in order to be able to even do what we're doing now, much less meet the state's ambitious goals. So, thinking about this chart and really thinking about this steep decline and then this plateau, practically, what does that mean? Starting in 2024 for Efficiency Vermont, we project 775 fewer homes per year weatherized, 55,000 fewer MMBTUs of heat saved, and 3,400 metric tons less of carbon dioxide saved. Basically the equivalent of keeping 735 more cars on the road every year starting in 2024. And that's all to say nothing of the fact that, Efficiency Vermont and sort of everyone throughout the state, we remain far short of the state's goal of weatherizing 80,000 homes. We have about 18 days left to hit that goal of 80,000 homes weatherized that we stated way back several years ago. I think we're at about the 40,000 figure. So clearly we're going to fall short of that goal. And as Efficiency Vermont looks at our thermal funding services in the out years, we are definitely worried about a decline in funding. So where do we go from there, knowing that this is going to happen? One more point I should make is this funding source is declining at a time when we all know we need to do more. This chart is from the EAN's annual report, and you can really focus in looking at the orange in the middle. In order to meet the emissions reductions goals in the Paris Climate Agreement, you can see in the middle, we would need to add 90,000 heat pump systems and retrofit 90,000 homes here in Vermont. And so you can see the scale of the need that we need, where we need to get to, and we're falling short. So clearly there needs to be a change in thermal funding here in the state. How can we do that? There are several different paths forward, and let me just kind of walk through each. The first one, the cleanest, the easiest solution would be if there was more direct federal aid. If the federal government was able to pass a stimulus bill and if there was more money, this would solve a lot of problems. But as my grandmother used to say, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a wonderful Christmas. We certainly cannot count on a high level of federal stimulus money. There is hope for the talks in Washington. They've been revived this week. We're seeing some more signs of more funding to state aid. There's still a lot of unknowns. I would note that Joe Biden promised to weatherize 2 million homes in 4 years. That is going to be very difficult to achieve, especially depending on the results of the Senate race in Georgia. I know it might seem strange to think about the context of sort of weatherizing homes in the Northeast Kingdom coming down to a Senate race in Georgia. But in terms of the chances of the kind of clean energy federal stimulus bill that could bring more money into Vermont, I do think a lot hinges on it. But here in Vermont, we never sit around and wait for federal solutions to any big problem, and we're not going to do that now. Efficiency Vermont is participating in an EAN sponsored weatherization at scale pitch, which would recapitalize Vermont's Weatherization Trust Fund to weatherize over 100,000 low to moderate income homes by 2030. We're calling this the weatherization moonshot because we know it's going to take big, bold action to achieve these kinds of weatherization goals. And the benefits of this would save money, this would improve health outcomes, and this would obviously cut GHG pollution. It's led by Neil Lunderville of Vermont Gas, Senator Bray, and many other coalition partners. How are we going to be able to do that? Funding is the key question. It's really funded by an all of the above approach, including green bonds, a pay-as-you-save model, direct investments by utilities, municipalities, and a combination of federal grant funding. We know this is not going to be cheap. The price tag may get pretty steep, which again is why we favor the all of the above approach. We also know this is a difficult time for bonding, but again, if we can reach that balance, this may be a way to kickstart that conversation about achieving our weatherization goals. And finally, the last big thing I would flag in terms of thinking about weatherization funding is the Act 62 final report is due on January 15th, 2021. As a reminder, when Act 62 passed the legislature in 2019, it called on the Public Utilities Commission to issue a report and present it to the legislature on the need to create an all fuels utility. That report is due next month. And just as a reminder, when we say all fuels in this context, we're really referring to largely unregulated fuels like home heating oil and propane. Everyone is very eagerly anticipating what the report's going to say. I don't want to get ahead of it, but I can say that Efficiency Vermont's position all along is that, as you've seen from the previous slides, the current funding sources are not sufficient to meet our weatherization goals. And so we don't want to get ahead of the process. We're eagerly waiting to see the report, but just for context setting, there are many different policy options. You could have a delivered fuel energy efficiency charge like we currently have on electricity that funds Efficiency Vermont's work. You could create a thermal renewable energy standard, create a tradable form of renewable energy credits like we have with the RES standard, or it could be a tax on these fossil fuels. So there's a lot of interest in this. We'll see what the report says, and we'll see what the legislation does. But it really is so important to get this right, given we know how important this weatherization work is, and we know that the sort of the funding uncertainty. And really my last slide, just to drive this point home, is as part of that Act 62 process, a lot of different agencies and people were able to submit reports and comments to the PUC. And I pulled this quote from a joint report that the Department of Public Service and that ACCD pulled together, where they said they estimate that from the period from 2020 to 2030, the sustained investments in low income and market rate programs increase personal income in the state $27 to $39 million per year, increase GDP 20 to 21 million per year, and employ 390 to 440 people throughout the analysis period. This is a time of great economic uncertainty. As a state, we need to be building our resiliency. We know weatherization works in terms of putting people back to work and increasing personal income. So that's sort of the stakes in terms of getting this right. And with that, I will stop. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Just one quick question I think that might be helpful to answer before you move on. Gabriella asks, are you saying Act 62 wouldn't necessarily touch weatherization work?
It really depends what the report says and what that funding source is and how it could be used. There really are there's a variety of ways it could go.
Okay, thank you. And I'll save the rest of the questions to the end for everyone.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Julia.
Hello. Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It might take a moment, but hopefully we can get this up and running. Can everyone see that slide that says VEPSA Renewable Energy Standard Tier 3 funding?
Yep, it looks great.
Great. Awesome. So everyone, I'll just introduce myself real quick. I'm Julia Leopold. I'm from the Vermont Public Power Supply Authority. I do communications work over there. Also a lot of involvement in stakeholder relations, and I also help administer our Tier 3 program. Just as a heads up, I can no longer see you. So if you are asking questions in the chat, I'm unable to see that until I stop my share, but hopefully we'll be able to get to them at the end of the presentation. So what I'm hoping to cover today, just a brief overview of Vermont's electric utilities. There are some interesting differences in how Vermont's electric utilities operate. So I want to cover that real quick, then provide an overview of the Renewable Energy Standard before deep diving into Tier 3. So an overview of Vermont's electric utilities. There are 17 total in the state. That map on the left shows each utility's territory, and each color corresponds to a different electric utility. I think a lot of people are most familiar with Green Mountain Power, so that's the green C that you see across most of Vermont. Up in the top portion of the map, you have Vermont Electric Co-op, and then all these different colors in the middle, mostly municipal electric utilities, which we'll talk more about those. But in Vermont, your electric utility is determined by your address and nothing more. Where you live determines where your electric will be coming from. And that's different from other states in the Northeast, where other states have something called retail choice, where you can actually choose your electric provider. So a little bit different here. And something worth noting, your electric utility does so much more than maintain the grid and provide you with electricity. We offer programs that actually can help provide you with money to make some changes by converting over from fossil fuel to electric. And again, that's going to be the bulk of this presentation. But just to break down those different types of utilities that we have, there are 3 different types. An investor-owned utility. That's Green Mountain Power. It is a for-profit electric utility. A lot of the decisions that are being made are being made by the company executives and by the shareholders. Then you have the co-ops, which historically co-ops were created to serve the most rural populations, not just in Vermont, but all across America. And here we have 2, Vermont Electric Co-op and Washington Electric Co-op. Again, they're nonprofit organizations. The customers of these utilities are considered members, and the members have a board of directors that make decisions on their behalf. So any money that isn't going back into the utility or into maintaining the grid gets returned back to the members in the form of lower rates or potentially even as a bill credit. Then you have the munis, and we call them public power utilities. There are 14 public power utilities across the state of Vermont. The largest is Burlington Electric. They have roughly 20 to 25,000 customers. But then there are some really small municipal electric utilities, and those are the members of the Vermont Public Power Supply Authority. So this map shows all of the different locations of the municipal electric utilities that are VEPSA members, and I've got them listed out. You can see their customer counts. They're all fewer than 6,000 meters. So I call them sometimes puny munis because they're so small. But essentially what these utilities did back in the late 1970s was come together as a group and say, hey, you know, we're pretty small, we're serving small amounts of customers, but we want to be able to offer services that are comparable comparable to a larger utility. So they grouped together and they formed the Vermont Public Power Supply Authority. And what we do is provide some services and some solutions on their behalf. One of them is administering the Tier 3 programs. So let's get into the Renewable Energy Standard. We'll just do a brief overview of it. The Renewable Energy Standard was enacted in 2015 through Act 56. It's split into 3 tiers, but it really accomplishes 2 things. So tiers 1 and 2 establish a renewable electric generation portfolio, and that increases over time. So the idea is that you have renewable generation within your electric supply, and that's going to grow. And then the second thing that it does, which is tier 3, is it requires utilities to participate in energy transformation projects. We'll talk more about that. But tiers 1 and 2, to just go into those a little bit deeper. So tier 1, it establishes that starting in 2017, all Vermont electric utilities will have a 55% renewable portfolio. That will increase to 75% by 2032. The 2020 requirement, I believe, was 59%. And in tier 1, you can source your electric supply from several different renewable energy generators across the Northeast and even in Canada. And this does include large hydro. If you don't comply with tier 1, you have to pay the alternative compliance payment, which is $10 a megawatt hour. And then what tier 2 does is it actually says that part of that tier 1 requirement, part of that 75% by 2032 has to come from new in-state distributed renewable energy generators, which is typically solar here in Vermont. New meaning that it has to have come online 2015 or later. So this started at 1% of the portfolio in 2017, and it increases to 10% of the portfolio by 2032. The 2020 requirement was 2.8%. And if you do not meet this, then the utility has to pay $62 a megawatt hour. So this is just a breakdown of what the Renewable Energy Standard looks like in terms of a generation portfolio. On the left, you have all of the different sources that a utility can purchase electricity from through a power purchase agreement. And then on the right, you have what it looks like after buying and selling renewable energy credits. So any renewable energy generator will produce these RECs. I think it's 1 REC per megawatt hour, and utilities are able to buy and sell them. And that's what really matters for the Renewable Energy Standard. So you can see that this is for VEPSA utilities in aggregate, meaning all of them combined. We have over 60% coming from hydro. That's largely how we're meeting the Renewable Energy Standard, but you do have this small sliver of solar, which is our tier 2 requirement. So now we're going to dive into tier 3, because I think this is the part that people are most interested in, is where is the funding coming from? What is tier 3? How can we take advantage of it? So tier 3 is the portion of the Renewable Energy Standard that requires utilities to participate in energy transformation projects. And if you're wondering what are energy transformation projects, they're defined as a project that can reduce fossil fuel consumed by utilities customers and the emission of greenhouse gases attributable to that consumption. So long story short, that basically means it's any project that reduces fossil fuel, and for utilities, it ideally converts them onto electric. So some examples are electrification measures like installing a heat pump. It could be buying an electric vehicle to replace your gas guzzler that you might have. It could be weatherization. It could be industrial energy efficiency, line extensions. So there's a lot there. There are a lot of energy transformation projects that are on the table. How do utilities participate in them? Well, we offer financial incentives. That can be in the form of a rebate after the fact. It could be in the form of an instant discount. Let's say you buy a heat pump water heater, you get an instant discount. Some of that discount is coming from your electric utility. It could be an upfront incentive, which is typically how we handle energy transformation projects that are line extensions. We offer a customer an incentive to help them connect to the grid. And it could be in the form of lowered electric rates. So a lot of different opportunities for us to provide financial incentives. It gets a little interesting how we are able to quantify this, because again, at the heart of it, we're reducing fossil fuel, but the way that we comply at a regulatory level is in a portion of our retail sales. So what we actually do is convert that fossil fuel reduction into a megawatt hour equivalent. So back in 2017, we had to have 2% of retail sales equivalents to meet our requirement. That increases to 12% by 2032. There was a little bit of a delayed start for the small municipals. They started on tier 3 in 2019. And if you look at our 2020 requirement, it's 5% for most utilities, 2.67% for most of the small munis. And if you don't meet the requirement, then you have to pay $62 a megawatt hour, which is pretty expensive. So what's the whole point of tier 3? Well, there are 3, I think, key things that really make this an interesting portion of our renewable energy standard. The main one is that it really helps to reduce fossil fuel from the non-electric sectors. So if you look at where we're seeing the most greenhouse gas emissions across the state of Vermont, it's largely coming from transportation. And then second runner-up is going to be from thermal. Electricity really does not generate a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions. So having tier 3 is a way to actually reduce the fossil fuel emissions from those other sectors, from transportation and from thermal. It also encourages customers to switch to electricity as the electric sector becomes more powered by renewables. The idea being that as we're getting cleaner and greener, it just makes more sense to switch to electricity since it's such a much better option than using fossil fuel. And ideally, it intends to mitigate the cost of compliance with tiers 1 and 2 by increasing an electric utility's electric sales. If you look at how much renewable energy costs, it can be more expensive than fossil fuel. So as utilities comply with tiers 1 and 2, it could potentially drive up their rates. So what tier 3 intends to do is say, well, hey, if we can get more electric sales, that should put some downward pressure on the rates. So that's the ultimate goal. So every utility has its own strategy on how it's going to meet its tier 3 compliance. But these 3 items on the screen, I think, are ones that most of the utilities have in common. I can really only speak for VEPS's utilities, but I have seen this come up in my discussions with a lot of the other electric utilities across Vermont. The number 1 is to prioritize electrification measures. So that means that as we are participating in these energy transformation projects, we want to focus on the ones that will convert from fossil fuel over to electricity. And the reason why is because it reduces the idea of cost shifting. So what I like to think about here is that imagine your neighbor buys a Tesla and gets $1,000 from the electric utility. And you're there and you say, well, hey, like, I wish I could buy a Tesla too, but I can't. That's just not in my budget right now. But how come my utility is giving my neighbor $1,000 and not me? Well, the good side of this is that you can actually have a link to lowered electric rates, or at least stable electric rates, as a result of there being more electric sales on the system. So even though your neighbor got the additional incentive, they're actually paying that back to the utility over time. It's revenue neutral for the utility, and that helps to keep your costs low. So there's no cost shifting that's going to occur. We also see all of our utilities employing both prescriptive and custom programs, and I'll define what that means a little bit more, but essentially that allows our programs to become available to all different rate classes, whether you're residential, whether you're commercial and industrial. There is a program that you can take advantage of an incentive. And then finally, there's this other pathway to meeting tier 3, and it's actually through tier 2. So tier 2, again, is usually in-state solar. If you have an overflowing bucket of tier 2 RECs at your disposal, let's say you have a really big solar project in your utility territory, that bucket can actually overflow and start to fill your tier 3 bucket. So if tier 2 is cost effective, then what a lot of utilities do is keep an eye on those tier 2 prices. They might buy more tier 2 when it's at a lower price to save it to use for tier 3 later on. So how do we get there? There are 4 different pathways to Tier 3 compliance. And this is going to get more into the funding and where it comes from. So there are rebates and instant discounts that are available in our prescriptive energy transformation projects. So these are typically available for residential and small business customers. The way it works is that the customer will buy or install the qualifying measure. That could be an electric vehicle or a bike. They'll submit their rebate application, and then we send back a check. There's also the instant discount route where you buy the qualified measure like a heat pump water heater, and you get the instant discount at the time that your contractor installs it, or you could also do that one as an after the fact rebate. So what's interesting about the prescriptive program is that the megawatt hour equivalent savings are already determined or prescribed by the technical advisory group. So there's essentially this group that gets together, they look at all of these different electrification measures, and they quantify how many savings a utility can claim. And then the utility is able to determine how much money that they can put on the table. So these incentives have a pretty wide range, anywhere from about $25 from an electric lawnmower up to $3,000 for an electric forklift. And if you break it down by the cost per megawatt hour, you're looking at about $20 to $50 per megawatt hour. We try to keep it, at least again on VEPS's side, we try to keep it pretty competitive with that Tier 2 bucket. We don't want it to go much above how much a Tier 2 rec could cost. So then the second pathway is through custom energy transformation projects. These are typically offered to commercial and industrial customers, and they're usually in the form of an upfront financial incentive. So the customer and the utility and sometimes Efficiency Vermont all come together and determine what the project is. The utility determines the incentive, and they pay it to the customer at the onset of the project. So we determine the incentive. We also determine how many savings we're able to claim for our compliance. But the Department of Public Service steps in and has to review and audit that to make sure that that's actually on track and it makes sense. So they'll review our analysis. So the interesting thing here is that it's pretty inexpensive in the long term. The utility cost for a megawatt hour equivalent savings is $5 to $20, again, per megawatt hour equivalent. But since it's offered as an upfront incentive, it could actually be a pretty big chunk of change. Typically on the floor, we see about $1,000 as an incentive, but it could go up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you have a new company coming into Vermont, they've chosen that they want to have all electric equipment when there is a fossil fuel alternative available to them, we could provide them with a pretty hefty incentive to help them and encourage them to make that switch to electric instead of fossil fuel. The other two pathways that we have, like I mentioned, excess Tier 2, you could roll excess Tier 2 credits into your Tier 3 bucket. That cost is about $35 a megawatt hour, which again is why we try to keep our portfolio around that same level. And then finally, you have the alternative compliance payment. And that's if the utility doesn't do anything, it's going to cost them about $62 a megawatt hour. So just because I can't help it, I tend to like to promote our different rebates that we have available to VEPSA member customers. This is for 2020. These will be changing for 2021. But right now you can get up to $1,400 back on a new electric vehicle. You can get up to $500 back on a pre-owned electric vehicle. If you are installing a cold climate heat pump, we can give you $400 back. We have gone ahead and decided to tack on a Weatherization Adder. So if your home meets one of our weatherization projects that are qualifying projects, and you can get up to an additional $400 back. Over on the right, where it says $100 WX, that means $100 for weatherized. $400 if you're weatherized and in a targeted community. We've been working with Efficiency Vermont to target several communities that are experiencing a high energy burden. We want to just make it a little bit more of a sweetened deal for those folks to be able to weatherize their home and install a heat pump. And if you're interested in how to get these rebates, you go to our website, vppsa.com. Up in the top right-hand corner in that little gray bar, it says rebate forms. You click on that, it will take you to the whole list. You just click on which one you want and you fill out the form and send it in to us. And that is it for me. I tried to fly through that because I know other folks have things that they want to say as well. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you, Julie. It's great to learn all about the utility offerings. This is Michelle Boomhauer, and I'm going to bring up my shared screen. And I'm not sure, could somebody confirm that you're seeing my presentation slide?
You look good.
Perfect, thank you. So as I mentioned, I'm Michelle Boomhauer. I'm the Director of Policy Planning and Intermodal Development for the Vermont Agency of Transportation. And within my group, I oversee legislative policy at both the state and federal level. We do coordinated planning with communities and other partners across the state, and also interagency planning. So we do a lot of work with the Agency of Natural Resources and the Public Service Department. And then we also have rail, aviation, and public transit within our group, and mapping and permitting and Act 250 work. So it's a very diversified activity of effort. The VW settlement funds are the first thing I'm going to talk about in terms of high level funding activities that are occurring. And oops, I just lost that.
Yeah, sorry.
And
I want to remind people to mute themselves. I think we're hearing some background and I can't actually mute participants. So if you can just make sure to mute yourself, that'd be great.
Can you mute yourselves? All right, I think I've got my household muted now too. So the VW settlement funds are the first of sort of the high level state and federal programming opportunities I'm going to talk about today. Due to a nationwide settlement stemming from fraudulent use of emissions defeat devices in diesel vehicles, Vermont received $18.9 million in funds from a settlement negotiated with Volkswagen. And our plan is, at the state level, is to use all of these funds for transportation electrification. And currently, the Agency of Natural Resources, who is administering this program, is piloting the delivery of electric transit buses and electric school buses across the state in different settings. And also, we within the Agency of Transportation have received funding, and I'll talk about that in a minute, for electric transit buses. And so we've been at this for I would say 4 or 5 years now, and just trying to understand the opportunity and the complexity that delivering bus service through an electric vehicle may create. And so these pilots are very helpful, and they will inform us with regards to how we can best deploy the VW settlement funds. Of the VW settlement funds, 15% were allowed to be set aside for electric vehicle charging equipment. And so a variety of grant offerings were made, and our last award was just concluded earlier this summer. And we were able to, once all of our awarded funds are implemented, which will be sometime during 2021, we had a bit of a delay due to COVID and having trouble getting some of the equipment we were trying to receive. But we will have installed electric vehicle charging, fast charging, which takes about 20 minutes to charge your vehicle, in public settings within 30 miles of all Vermonters. And so this is along interstate corridors, along highway corridors. Some of these are located in downtowns, and Drive Electric Vermont has a great map that helps people understand where they can find electric vehicle charging equipment. Additionally, the funds can be used for ferries, forklifts, airport equipment. We haven't had much call for those, but there are opportunities for electrifying more transportation equipment as we move forward. Our biggest effort has been, as I mentioned, through the the deployment through the Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment Grant Program, which the Agency of Commerce and Community Development has been administering. And in addition to the VW funds, this program has received funds this past legislative session through the Capitol bill to add $750,000 to our deployment of electric vehicle charging equipment. So we're going to be announcing another grant round coming up. And that grant round is really going to be targeted towards getting some level 2 equipment in multifamily housing units to continue to promote and really make it accessible for folks in all kinds of housing situations to be electric vehicle owners. And I want to emphasize that oftentimes the applicants for these grant awards may be a municipality, they may be a building owner in the case of housing units. So it's best to coordinate directly with the Agency of Commerce to figure out how a project might be advanced if you have something in mind. The other new program in the past couple of years is the Electric Vehicle Incentive Program. And we had an initial offering of $1.1 million in incentive funds for this new vehicle plug-in electric vehicle incentives. And we expended all of those funds this past October, and the legislature awarded another $950,000 in our budget to continue to advance the program, which was relaunched just recently in early November. And you can go to Drive Electric Vermont's website to find out about these incentives, or the Agency of Transportation website will redirect you to Drive Electric Vermont. We've had a great partnership with our distribution utilities. The ones that Julia mentioned earlier have all been a part of helping us deploy these funds to the dealerships around the state who sell plug-in electric vehicles. And they are create an incentive of up to $4,000. This is income-based in terms of how much money you can receive for the type of incentive you're looking at. Julia did a great job of talking about the Tier 3 and mentioned how it can apply to transportation projects. And just reiterate that the distribution utilities offering of incentives has been very rich, and oftentimes these incentives will dovetail with other incentives, such as a state incentive or federal incentives that are being offered for electric vehicles or e-bikes or other initiatives for charging stations. Green Mountain Power has been very generous in offering up to $40,000 for the electrical interconnect for some of the DC fast charging stations that receive grants. And then we also have I just want to double check my next slide. Before I get off electric vehicles, the bottom bullet is talking about the capstone, and we're actually working with community action agencies across the state with Capstone as the lead to deliver the Mileage Smart program, which offers incentives for low-income drivers for used fuel-efficient vehicles, including plug-in electric vehicles and hybrids. And that program has really just gotten its feet under it this past few months. And I believe we're somewhere in the mid-50s in terms of vehicles that have been delivered to low-income drivers through that program. So Google Mileage Smart and check out that program, and please share that information. So I talked about public transit electric buses a little bit a minute ago. We are able to utilize special funds that are grant funds we had to apply for through the Federal Transit Administration. And we've secured funding for 12 electric buses. 2 of those are in service and 10 more are waiting to be delivered. We had a recent grant award that created a fairly sizable investment for us. And once again, the utilities under their Tier 3 standards have contributed significantly to helping us make the local match that's required to receive these federal funds through their investment in charging infrastructure, which has really been help. I put a link near the top of the chat room just a few minutes ago. We, the legislature asked us to design a new program, which we call the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grant Program. And $500,000 in funds was just made available at the close of the last legislative session to implement this program. And we announced today, actually, that we've awarded 12 of these grants to various projects that address transportation demand management and improve mobility and accessibility for transportation dependent Vermonters and reduce single occupancy vehicle use, but most importantly, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, there's a wide array of entities that were eligible to apply for these grants. So I encourage you to go to that link in the website and see the types of grants that were awarded. This will be, I'm not sure if this is going to be a recurring grant or not yet, but it will be something interesting for energy committees to consider, and also to maybe get involved in any of the projects that were awarded in your community. I think many of you are aware of downtown designation that is offered to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. Through achieving designated downtown status, a community can receive extra funding or extra points on grants, or be eligible for programs that aren't typically available to others. And so this is all in support of revitalizing downtowns, growing more housing and more jobs in downtowns so that folks have opportunities to reduce their transportation footprint, in particular, by being able to work and live in the same place that they have chosen in terms of their dwelling. This program allows for all kinds of various activities which will be in support of transportation connections, improvements, or any sort of enhancement that will attract folks to want to consider walking and biking within their downtown area, or taking public transit. And so that's another nice one to check out. And similarly, for communities that are looking to, maybe they're not a designated downtown, but they want to create more of those characteristics in their community, we have a new program, the Better Connections program, which really helps a community do intensive planning around how they would make these things happen, so that when grant funds become available, that they're ready to move forward with a project. So that's a really great program. I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit about the federal transportation funding efforts that we are watching or that we utilize. And this is just for general background to help people understand where we're drawing funds from for implementation at the state level. The Transportation Authorization Act, which is enabled by the federal government or by Congress, and it happens about every 5 to 6 years, sets the framework for how we will invest transportation resources that are awarded through Congress each year. And Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, the FAST Act, is the current bill that we're working on. We expect there to be a reauthorization next year, sometime after the new Congress is put into place. The current FAST Act authorization would have expired this past September, but it was extended for 1 year. So we're operating on a continuing resolution for this. But this is what helps us fund our bridges, roadways, transit, rail, safety, bike and pedestrian facilities, sort of a whole range of activities. And so we really work to be creative as to how we can implement these funds in ways that will help in reducing greenhouse gas initiatives and providing Vermonters with a variety of transportation resources in terms of having transportation choice. The low or no emission vehicle program is the competitive grant program that I mentioned, most of the funding for our electric transit buses. And so we work closely with our transit providers who are interested in moving to electric buses and applying for grants to that program. We also have the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, which is a dedicated funding source, which helps communities which are have issues with clean air. Some communities are required to implement the CMAQ program in a particular way because they have exceeded air quality thresholds, and then other communities like all of Vermont right now, which are meeting our air quality requirements, have more flexibility in how we implement these CMAQ funds. And currently Vermont uses these funds most heavily for transit and rail projects, in particular passenger rail through helping fund Amtrak, as well as working on diesel retrofits for rail programming at times by our bicycle and pedestrian programs, and then alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure. So we might, through the transit side of the house, invest in not only electric vehicles, but in other pollution reduction activities for, or retrofits for transit vehicles. The alternative fuel facilities designation is one which allows the highway corridors to be designated for alternative fuels, including zero emission corridors. There's no current funding for infrastructure improvements along with this particular designation right now, but there is a provision for the signage when you have a designation, and we have to have all of Vermont's all of our interstates, as well as many of our major highway networks like Route 2, Route 7, Route 4, designated as zero emission corridors. And this correlates with designations that occurred in Canada, as well as designations which have occurred south of us in Massachusetts and some other New England states. And so should there become programs that allow for funding of alternative fuel designated corridors, such as EV corridors, we may be able to get money for more electric vehicle charging stations. So what's coming? We're closely watching bills that have already been drafted by House and Senate committees at the federal level. We are seeing a lot of interest by the Democratic and progressive caucuses with regards to implementing more carbon reduction programming, more community transportation investment grants, EV charging, hydrogen fueling, climate innovation grants, and active transportation programs. And so we're cautiously optimistic that we'll see some funding come into the next federal reauthorization bill around these areas so we can advance more investments. And we also recognize that it's going to be, as was stated earlier, dependent on what happens in the Georgia Senate elections, is really going to have a lot of impact with regards to, whether or not some of these efforts move forward, or if we are kind of in the same existing framework. So I have staff people who are talking 2 or 3 times a week with our congressional staffers, and we're always looking for innovative ways to influence legislative policy and or to address the funding requirements that we have for advancing many of these issues that we are looking to address within our transportation system in terms of beginning to move towards an electrified transportation system across the state. So I'm going to stop sharing now and conclude my remarks with that.
Thank you to all of our speakers. Can you hear me all right? Great.
Yes.
So I'm going to just go through and try to go through some of the questions. And if people have other questions, feel free to start typing in the chat. I know we just put a lot of information out in front of you guys, so feel free to just ask some clarifying questions. But first, I'm going to go back to some questions for Dan. One of the questions was, do we have the workforce necessary to meet the goals of the weatherization?
Yeah, I mean, I think by and large the answer is yes. I mean, the supply and demand are always finely balanced, sort of depending on in the marketplace. And I think that that's one of the strongest arguments for trying to really solve this and get a long-term funding source in place for weather. We see the contract community responds to this when they and brings on more workers when they have that kind of certainty. As we had one-off one-year funds last year for weatherization training as part of Act 62. Efficiency Vermont led a few classes with Vermont Technical College. All of those classes sold out instantly. I mean, they didn't cost anything, but they all booked up instantly. So we know there is more demand, but the short answer to your question is it's not an issue in terms of if there was stimulus funding. You know, we've seen with our school indoor air quality work that the contracting community is able to respond very quickly. So it wouldn't be prohibitive, but you know, if there was a long-term funding source, we could develop this workforce even more.
Right. And actually, off of the IAQ work, the school indoor air quality work, there's a question about, do you know what type of testing is being done, and does it include PM 2.5? Yeah, we definitely are doing testing. I'm going to just post my email in the chat. It's kind of a complicated, in the weeds answer, and I can connect you with the right people there. But the short answer is yes, we are testing. But beyond that, I'd have to refer you to one of our IAQ experts for the exact specifications there. Great. And then the next question was, and I answered part of this in the chat, but I think it's important to also talk about, is there a way that town energy committees can step in and help EVT services or support EVT in general? Yeah, and sort of, you know, as you said in the chat, Michelle, it is difficult in terms of entering people's homes. But you know, sort of as a related question, you know, Deirdre Holmes asked, you know, and she said in Charlotte, the Energy Committee is working on a weatherization project in connection with the button-up energy visits, but we're having a hard time reaching low to moderate income households, and sort of how you solve that. And I you know, Deirdre, first of all, you hit one of the big difficulties that we have, right, in terms of how to solve that problem. I mean, first of all, every consumer is just bombarded with offers, right? You know, no money down, zero, you know, for in any aspect of your life. And so you're competing with skepticism for all of that. And second of all, you know, we know that weatherization projects are expensive, right? I mean, I think there are plenty of people that would like to do one, but you know that installing a cold climate heat pump, it does cost money, and sort of how you overcome that. We have a zero interest home energy loan with VSECU, which is a great product, which I can include a link to in the chat. That helps. I think going to trusted voices, even sort of outside of Efficiency Vermont, is a big part of this, whether it's local nonprofits, really word of mouth from neighbors and residents, that's a big part of it. You know, or, you know, the community action partnerships that we referred to, you know, that can really help as well. Yeah, I don't know, Julia, if you have any other perspective on that. I know in your communications world, you probably see that too.
I mean, I think you did a great job covering all of the different options. Something that we are looking into from VEPSA and working with our municipalities is how can the municipal lead by example? So if you have a project that can be taken on within your municipal building, whether that's, you know, maybe installing a heat pump in the building or doing weatherization work, where you can partner with Efficiency Vermont on that and work with your community on the budget, I think that's a really fantastic way to showcase the work that's available. And then when people come into the municipal building, whether it's, you know, a library or public school, they can see the work that's been done, and, you know, they'll see it consistently. It's not like, you know, if you're going to a public library, you're probably not just going there once and never going back again, but you'll be seeing a reinforced message. So that's what I would say is work with your municipality to have a partnership with Efficiency Vermont, so that way your local buildings can be an example to the community.
Yeah, and one of the, absolutely. One other thing I would just add is not to forget about the lowest hanging fruit, right? The very simple things, in terms of sealing doors, hay bales, making sure, and things like that are closed. I just posted the link to our DIY page in the chat, which is really, some of the simplest, easiest, low cost measures that people can do to help weatherize their homes.
Great. And switching subjects just a little bit here, there's also a question in the chat. Julia, it came in during your presentation, but I would offer all three of you probably have some thoughts. Is there any work being done to strengthen the grid for the additional load that EVs will add to the overall load?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think the way that VEPSA this is that we, I think our utilities tend to step up to the changes that we need to make as they need to be made. So I would say there are probably no advanced infrastructure changes that are currently being made, but that's also partially because we found that there's a lot of room on the grid to grow. With all of the fantastic efficiency work that Efficiency Vermont has been doing over the past 20 years, that's left a lot of headroom on the overall system. I think a lot of the changes that we're going to initially be seeing as we electrify all the things are going to be more of those like local and small scale grid changes, like upgrading transformers to accommodate multiple EV chargers in homes on a block, or potentially even making at the customer level circuit panel upgrades in their own home so they can accommodate an additional heat pump in maybe a very old farmhouse building. So I think those are the kind of changes that we're going to see in the very near term, but in terms of big picture, we have the space that we need in order to be able to grow.
Michelle, I mentioned this up front that, as part of our 3-year budget cycle at Efficiency Vermont, we've got some money carved out for this flexible load management program in terms of working with utilities like VIPSA to try to identify these technologies and address this very problem. And that even if we do see a big uptake in electric vehicles, making sure not everybody's coming home from work and plugging in right at 6:00 p.m. And so hopefully we can continue to study that and make sure we're anticipating those problems.
There was a few other questions in the chat, but it looks like a lot of it has been answered with different links that people were looking for. Do we have any other questions out there? We have about another 15 minutes that we can ping this wonderful panelist for questions. So another question in from Gabriella. EVT is changing customer incentives on weatherization starting October. Was this predicted or was it a surprise?
Sure, no, it's a great question. This was predicted, but again, it does speak to that need to have the long-term, steady, stable funding stream, so we don't have to do that in the future. Part of the reason for the change was that the year before, as part of the Act 62 legislation that passed the legislature in 2019, there was one-time money set aside that allowed us to offer these blockbuster offers, and then that funding stream expired, and unfortunately we did have to pivot in October. So it was predicted, but it really does speak to the need to find that stable long-term funding source to give the marketplace the certainty it needs.
Great. And Julie, I think this is a question for you on the utility side. The question is, are there rate designs innovations that are being considered to help with grid flexibility and kind of what Dan was talking about, I think, with encouraging people to charge at certain times?
Yeah, no, that is such a great question. And rate design, absolutely, I think is going to be in our future and something that is a really hot topic among the legislature. So I can tell you that from VEPSA's standpoint, part of rate design and innovation is directly connected to the technology that we have available for our customers. And that specifically is smart metering. So something that we're working on right now is rolling out smart metering to our VECSA member customers. And we will likely be moving that forward in 2021. So we selected our vendor. It's just still going through the final process before it can actually be implemented, I think around next summer. But something that we're also doing regarding rate design flexibility, in Vermont, our municipal electric utilities are regulated by the state. And that is very different from a lot of other states across the country where, because a municipal electric utility is locally governed and run by local elected officials, they tend to not have to go through the typical statewide regulations. So something that VECSA is working on right now and is currently passing around among our stakeholders is a potential proposal for legislation for the upcoming session that would allow for more municipal rate making flexibility while maintaining state oversight. So we're kind of hoping to be able to find a middle ground where municipal electric utilities can have more room to be innovative within their rate design while still having Public Utility Commission oversight in place. Kind of a little teaser for you to keep an eye out for that in the upcoming session.
A lot of things to keep our eyes out for the upcoming sessions. A lot going on. Michelle, there's a question here saying that some states require employers to have commute trip reduction programs. Is there any appetite for that in Vermont?
I think it's certainly an item that's been floated and discussed at the legislative level. Right now, of course, we have a voluntary transportation demand management program, with the exception of a few locales where businesses, due to their Act 250 permit requirements, have been required to implement TDM measures. I think the best example of that is the University of Vermont, the University of Vermont Medical Center, Champlain College, where these institutions entered into an agreement so that they could construct the facilities they needed with less parking for their patrons and their employees, in particular by creating a Transportation Management Association, which is now called the Chittenden Area TMA. We also have a TMA over in the Upper Valley, which serves kind of the Dartmouth, Norwich area. And those entities have found great success in getting employees to take alternative transportation by carpooling, taking the bus, telecommuting, et cetera. In terms of making it a mandatory effort, I think we're probably a few years away from that. I think we're going to see the impacts of COVID-19 continuing to pressure businesses as we move over the next year to two. And, we would really like to see sort of a comeback for the economy and for businesses before we start thinking about making more strident demands on them. But I think that there are a lot of voluntary opportunities for businesses who want to move in this direction to be able to engage with the TMAs, with the Go Vermont program at the state level, where we have a lot of resources for businesses as well, to be able to sort of create their own green footprint and encourage their employees to do the same.
Michelle, I can jump on Lori Sharp's question in terms of the difficulty of reaching LMI households and if we envision more money for incentives in the future in order to meet the GHG reduction goals. I mean, the short answer is that we would love at Efficiency Vermont to be able to do more. And we would love it if there was more money for bigger incentives. The question of how is really one for the legislature and for the PUC. You saw in Julia's presentation all of the different things that they're doing that can help meet those GHG reduction goals. Whether it's electric vehicles, electric bikes, weatherization, cold climate heat pumps, all of those things reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They all cost money. And so it really is a question, again, for the legislature as sort of where that funding stream is going to come from. But we would love to be able to do more.
add to that by saying that there have been a lot of discussions among the all the utilities as a group and Efficiency Vermont to talk about where are there gaps in the Efficiency Vermont programs that can be met by Tier 3? Because like Dan said, their thermal funding is declining. And we want to make sure that when Efficiency Vermont is putting money on the table from those thermal funds, that it's going towards weatherization. So where can we step in to kind of fill in those gaps? Does that mean that there's a combined Efficiency Vermont and utility program where if a low-income household is replacing their fossil fuel heating system with heat pumps, essentially ducted heat pump system, can utilities put more money on the table? Where previously Efficiency Vermont can only cover going from electric resistant heat to heat pump technology. So where can we fill in to make these programs just more attractive to low-income households? Because I think from what we've all seen, the biggest hurdle is that upfront cost. How can we reduce that? So yeah, I would just say that there's a lot of discussion around that topic right now. There's no answer yet. There's definitely no silver bullet, only silver buckshot. So we're trying to figure out how to make it work as best as we can.
Yeah, and on that, I saw Keith Epstein in the chat and Mark had both floated the idea of a green bond. There is a lot of interest out there in Vermont. Again, this Weatherization at Scale group is really drilling down into that and what that would look like and how you mobilize that, the private capital from citizens of Vermont there. So I would say stay tuned. Hopefully we'll get some more details on that, but certainly that is an idea that's gaining some momentum.
I believe some, like Montpelier, some municipalities have done it at like a local level to deal with their municipal buildings and establishing a rotating fund to be able to fund some local initiatives. So I think it might be a good time to wrap up unless there's any more questions coming in or if any of the panelists have some final words that they want to share.
I just want to say thank you, Michelle, because I know there are a lot of people from all the different utilities that are very knowledgeable on the renewable energy standard in Tier 3. So honored that you invited me to come talk about it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Just echo that. Thank you for putting all this together.
Yeah,
I would chime in, and I really want to thank the participants. The energy committees are really key for advancing the groundwork that needs to occur at the community level. And I just thank everybody for their enthusiasm, for taking the time over the weekend to participate in this conference and join us today, and for your continued enthusiasm as we move forward. Your communications with your legislators are key. And, we're all in this together, and we're all going to problem solve and advance our way through this as we move ahead. So thank you.